Thank you for having me for a topic that has been with me for quite a while. In fact, when I opened my cupboard this afternoon to get a sweater, because it's fairly cold by now here, I found this one, which says, I think you can read it, Loma Linda University. It's not because I have connections with Loma Linda University, but this sweater was given to me by Bill Lovelace. Some of you may remember Bill, and he was very much involved in a symposium we had some 22 years ago on divorce and remarriage. Ehe, Scheidung und Wiederheirat is the book, and Bill Lovelace has contributed to it quite a bit, and I'm still glad for that. So the topic has been with me for quite a while, and I would like to do it as deal with it as practically as possible, though it is not a, strictly speaking, a pastoral counseling approach, but more of a pastoral theology approach that I'm taking. I'm a pastoral counselor, so I do have my MDiv from Andreas University, but also a master in counseling and PhD in pastoral counseling. So I've got the whole spectrum here. Let me start with a Bible text that we all know, and then we'll deal with divorce from a church perspective. The Bible text is from Mark chapter 10, and I'll read from the New International Version. Some Pharisees came and tested him, that is Jesus, by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" he replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote this law," Jesus replied. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they no longer are two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let men not separate." When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, "Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery." So if you want, the New Testament writers are very, very upfront about the topic of divorce. They clearly state no. And as a result, the Christian church in all centuries has set high standards as to the impossibility of divorce. Nevertheless, in all ages, there have been separation and dissolutions of marriage, and I'm primarily, apart from teaching, a marriage counselor. And you find that even in Christian churches, believe it or not. And it appears to be so even more today. And therefore, I think we need to deal with the topic, both theologically as well as pastorally. So let's start with a little reality check. And this is where I would have liked to have breakout sessions so that we can share a little bit with each other. Now we have to do it all in our minds, which is possible as well. I would like to ask you to perhaps, if you have a piece of paper nearby, use a piece of paper or just do it in your head, whatever you like. I have 3 questions for you. Question number 1, as a reality check, I would like to ask you to think of your church and have an intelligent guess. How much of an issue is this topic in your church? When I say percentage, it's like how many of your couples in the church or of your church members have experienced a divorce? Just go through, kind of scan your church, the people you know, and get an estimate just for yourself. We can't discuss it. It's just a little warm-up exercise so we get into the topic. The second question I would like you to ponder is when you think back, and this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, and here it would be nice to have little breakout rooms because we are in different age ranges. But when you joined the church, when you became a member, and for some people it may be a long time ago. In fact, this past week I celebrated my 49th baptismal anniversary. So 7 times 7 or Jubilee year, quite a long time. Some people may not have been that long in church. But when you joined the church, how did people deal with the issue of divorce then? And now you can guess the third question, I guess. The third question is, how does your church deal with the issue today? Just ponder these 3 questions for a brief moment. We're not going to discuss it, but it will help to get your mindset to the topic. And if some questions come from these thoughts, we will have the opportunity to discuss after the presentation. Yes, some people say they no longer have a church. That's fine as well. Think of the next church around the corner. That's fine too. Okay, you have some thoughts in your mind. Hopefully you have some people perhaps in your mind. And let's remember that we don't talk about numbers. We don't talk about documents in terms of church manual, though that will appear somewhere in the middle of my presentation somewhere. We are talking about people. So let's remember that now during the presentation and in our discussion. So how do we deal with reality? We have done a little bit of a reality check. How do we deal with the reality we have just been pondering a little bit? And I promised in my little teaser and my write-up that I would boil it down to 4 positions a church can take towards divorce. I would like to present these 4 positions, first of all, and then go into a little bit of more detail. Position number 1. And I'm not saying this is my position. I'm just presenting 4 different types of positions. Number 1, divorce is okay. Okay. Position number 2, divorce is wrong. So you can see there's a polar and opposite kind of position. It's very simple, straightforward. As I said, I boiled it down to 4. Obviously, you could create something like 400 positions. Position number 3, option number 3, divorce is wrong, except. And position number 4 that I would like to present, divorce is wrong, but. So these are the 4 positions I would like to discuss with you. Divorce is okay, divorce is wrong, except, or divorce is wrong, but. And this is, as I said, a theological input that I would like to give, or philosophical, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, let's start. Some people would suggest divorce is okay. And while this position doesn't necessarily claim that divorce is good or that divorce should be sought, it still would probably be rejected by most Christian churches. It is very pragmatic, maybe considered pastoral, but theological argument for it is a little bit tricky, but it can be done. Now, first of all, you would suggest with this position, divorce is okay, that the statements in the New Testament, like the one I just read from Mark, the statements are culture bound. And indeed, that is an important argument because they are. The New Testament is written in a completely different culture, in a completely different time, with a completely different mindset. They are. And I think that is an important hermeneutical principle. We need to remember that the New Testament, the whole Bible, has been written in a different time, in a different culture, and we cannot transfer things one-to-one into our time. So in that sense, I can understand the position divorce is okay. However, if I say the statements in the New Testament or in the Bible in general are culture-bound, we have a dangerous hermeneutical principle. Because we might change things and adjust things to how we like it. Interesting spelling error I'm just detecting here, but my mother tongue is not English, so I'm excused. But Freud would have his fun here. Now, a second line of argument, apart from this culture bound, is that we say, or people who hold this position would say, we have to adjust to the reality of our time. We have to adjust to reality. Divorce just happens. And in a pastoral sense, of course, we have to say that, yes, there is a reality and we have to adjust to reality. We have to take into consideration that we live in a sinful world. We have to take into consideration that things are difficult, and we cannot pretend, for instance, divorce doesn't exist, problems don't exist in marriages and so forth. However, I would dare to ask there whether adjustment means we give up our ideals. If I am sailing, I don't know whether any of you are sailing on a boat. If you're sailing and you have your compass to one direction and the wind drives you off to another direction, you still want to have your ideal, your orientation, your bearing in mind in order to reach your goal in the end. So I'm not sure whether reality means that you have to give up your ideals. Now, at times it has been questioned whether this position is really pastoral, because it sounds so pastoral. You know, you want to get a divorce? Okay, fine. I don't think it's even pastoral, because it misses the point that people who do go through a divorce usually suffer tremendously with guilt, shame feelings at times. And even if the pain of divorce is kind of minimized because the marriage has been absolutely toxic and destructive, still to say, oh, well, it's okay, is not really helpful and does not really take serious the loss that is always involved in a divorce. So I'm not, as you may notice, I'm not quite happy with that position, though I do have some understanding. The second position that I presented would be at the other end of the spectrum. Divorce is wrong. And please notice the full stop, the period at the end of the sentence, divorce is wrong. And somebody already commented, I used the section in Mark, and I'll come to that in a moment, that there is an exception clause in Matthew. But first of all, we could say that is very, very biblical. The New Testament is very clear on divorce being wrong. And therefore, now I'm overstating it a little bit, but you get the drift, the idea why this is a bit tricky. A Christian cannot divorce and be a Christian, because it's wrong. It just cannot work, okay? So in a way, divorce becomes a defining factor of who is a Christian and who isn't. And if you have been a Christian, go through a divorce, you suddenly become a non-Christian. Again, I'm overstating a little bit, but not too much, because there's one church that is particularly keen on that issue and holds that position primarily, and that is the Roman Catholic Church. If you, in the Roman Catholic Church, if you divorce, if I'm 100% correct, if you get a remarriage afterwards, you're automatically excommunicated, which means you're disfellowshipped. That would be our Adventist traditional term. But in the Roman Catholic context, it means you are excluded from salvation. Because as you know, in the Roman Catholic teaching, the body of Christ is literally there in the communion, and you partake Christ into yourself through communion. And if you are excluded from communion, you're lost, basically. You can't have Christ any longer. I'm not discussing the communion understanding of the Catholic Church. I'm just trying to show the drama that is in such a position pastorally. And I don't envy my Catholic colleagues, the priests, who have to kind of live with that position. And currently it is under a lot of discussion. But what I'm saying is divorce is wrong does have implications for working with your church. Okay. By the way, the Catholic Church has wonderful ways and means to get around it. I guess some of you may know it, how they deal with it. They simply, it's not simple. They try to find ways to annul the marriage. That is, they say the marriage has not been a marriage, and therefore it's not a divorce. And then you're fine. Costs a lot of money usually to hire the church lawyers in canon law to find some way around to make your marriage a non-marriage, and then you can stay. Or another one, I had a fellow student when I was studying for my doctorate. She was a Roman Catholic, a devout Roman Catholic, but had a remarriage. So she took her church very seriously and did not go to Catholic communion because she was excommunicated. So she needed Christ, so she went to the Orthodox Church instead and took communion there, because for the Orthodox Church, it's all right. You can get divorced twice. The third time round, it better works. Okay, so this is the position: divorce is wrong. Let's come to another position. Basically, divorce is wrong, except. This is the official position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church as described in the church manual. And attempts to correct this position, for instance, by the Divorce and Remarriage Commission installed in 1995 at Utrecht General Conference, unfortunately led instead to a broadening of the position. And I'll come to that in a moment. And if you need more, we'll have some more in the discussion. Now, this position, divorce is wrong, except, is based on the so-called exception clause in the Gospel of Matthew. Except for fornication, the good old King James Version said, or for marital unfaithfulness. The Greek word in one is adultery, and in another case in Matthew, there are two places, it's porneia. And porneia, I don't think needs translation anymore. We know this day and age what porn really is all about. Now, this particular argument as justification for divorce, i.e. divorce is wrong, except, which means divorce is right if the condition is met, this argument actually is rejected by most New Testament scholars. And I'll tell you why in a moment. You'll see why it is rejected by most New Testament scholars. It does appear to be much more pastoral than to say divorce is wrong, full stop, end of story. It appears to be more pastoral, but it raises a lot of issues as to what exactly is marital unfaithfulness. Now, if you look into our church manual, in fact, you find a little bracket to explain for us what marital unfaithfulness entails. And I'm always amused, if it wouldn't be such a serious topic, to read this bracket. Number one, it states homosexuality. Frankly, my wife wouldn't care if I'm sleeping with another woman or another man. That's not the point. The unfaithfulness is not because of the gender of the other person. It mentions sex with children. Obviously, that is criminal behavior and totally unacceptable and has nothing to do with the topic of divorce and this exception clause. And there's more in it, which I find particularly funny in the bracket, and that is the word perversion. I hope we are all adults, so I can ask you, what exactly is sexual perversion? Now, we are at the moment, I don't know how many people we are online, but there are quite a number of people. And I guess we would get about 50, 60, 80, 100 different answers to the question. And in fact, as Adventists, we do not have enough imagination what exactly sexual perversion might be. And we could add another volume to our church manual every 5 years to really make sure we catch them all, the sexual perversions. You get my drift, I guess. Therefore, this issue of marital unfaithfulness is a bit tricky. Violence is mentioned as well, which usually is not thought of at first as a marital unfaithfulness. By the way, Freud said, just to make sure we are on the same page, Sigmund Freud suggested sexual perversion is any sexuality that does not serve procreation. And that's why he called homosexuals perverse. Perversion was not a bad name. It was just something that described, for him anyway, sexual activity that was not meant to be procreative. Which, if I look at the general average age in our group here, you know what to think of yourself if you follow Freud. I don't, but up to you. Now, furthermore, this concept of accept would continue with a concept that in many cultures we have overcome, fortunately, at least in our culture in Germany, and that is the concept of guilt and innocence in a divorce. Because if that justifies divorce, you would have to find out who did what. You would have to spy on people. But the most important issue, or the most important argument that I find most convincing, divorce is wrong except would make sin a redeeming factor. If you want to get a divorce from your wife, or as a wife from your husband, just make sure they end up in bed with somebody else. Ha, hooray, I'm free at last. I'm liberated. I'm redeemed of my marriage. Sin as a redeeming factor is absolute nonsense. I hope, at least I hope, we can agree on that. So let me say a few things about Matthew's exception clause, as theologians call it. It's a little bit of a digression here from my topic, but it may be helpful to some of us. The interesting thing about Matthew's exception clause is that in fact only strict Matthew provides for an exception. And that is weird, because Matthew is a gospel that has been written for Jews primarily. And in Matthew, you find the strictest versions of how we should behave, or what is right and what is wrong. You know, the Sermon on the Mount, just think of that. If you say to somebody, you are an idiot, you already committed murder. I mean, that is radical, at least with my driving style, because I find that I occasionally at least think, what an idiot. Okay. Only Matthew, who is so strict in his pronouncements that he puts into Jesus's mouth, or what he explains in the gospel, he says, well, divorce, no, is wrong, except if, you know, then it's okay. Doesn't make sense. Okay. And the unanimity of the other New Testament writers does raise question, because all the other writers do not have this exception clause. And as I already tried to explain a little bit with, yeah, I've got a weird sense of humor with all the perversions and stuff, but the implications raise questions that are quite serious, in fact. Therefore, there needs to be some kind of another explanation for the exception clause. As I said, most New Testament scholars will agree that the exception clause does not mean divorce is okay if only somebody is committing adultery or having porneia. Where there is not as much agreement among theologians, New Testament scholars, and I'm not a New Testament scholar, so I'm just telling you what I've read and heard somewhere, is when it comes to what actually does it mean. We can say for sure what it does not mean, the reasons I mentioned, but what does it mean? And one possibility, one explanation that is being given by some scholars is that it is a pastoral way of actually underlining what Jesus is trying to say. Divorce is a no-no. No divorce. But if you consider it at all, it can only happen if something happens that is unthinkable, i.e. adultery. So basically, this marital unfaithfulness underlines it twice, kind of. That's one explanation. However, the Jewish context, when Jesus said it, divorce was quite common, probably far more common actually than marital affairs or extramarital affairs, I should say, and adultery. And the disciples didn't understand it. I mean, those days may not have been all that much difference as we sometimes think. But the idea is here, it is a pastoral response. And Matthew is trying to underline it by stating it is so unthinkable as adultery is unthinkable in a Christian context. Now I'll show another answer that is given by a guy called Baltensweiler. He is a Swiss theologian, and he wrote his PhD thesis on divorce and remarriage, or divorce in the New Testament. And he did something interesting, which I cannot prove. I can only tell you what he wrote, but I cannot kind of confirm or test it, because I'm not a New Testament scholar. And I'm glad that I can read one or two Greek words, but I certainly cannot read Aramaic. And what he did is he translated the text in Matthew back into Aramaic, into the Aramaic language. And from the ductus of the text, he concluded that Jesus is referring here to, in the Aramaic language, and Jesus obviously spoke Aramaic, not Greek, that in the Aramaic language, he's referring to marriages which shouldn't have been marriages in the first place. That is, marriages between relatives, incestuous relationships, except for incestuous relationships, which are not marriages in the first place, no divorce, which is an interesting approach. And perhaps, I don't know, perhaps the Catholic Church comes from that kind of mindset that they suggest, well, if it's not a marriage, divorce is not a divorce really, and you are fine. Okay, but whatever you take as an explanation what Matthew actually means with his exception clause, New Testament scholars generally agree it is not that divorce is okay under particular circumstances. So let me go back. I said that this is the position that the church manual holds. In this book that I have shown you, actually, the paper is translated into German, the document from the Divorce and Remarriage Study Commission from 1995. They tried to correct this position a little bit. And for some reason, the Church Manual Committee, this is a little bit, what do you call it? Cloak and dagger, something like that story. The Church Manual Commission decided, well, that is a bit too radical, what they suggested here. We understand we need to be more merciful, and therefore we will increase the bracket. We will soften the language in the Church Manual, be a little bit more merciful, watering down the language. Some people would have said in Atlanta in 2000 at the General Conference, and will broaden what actually represents an exception. But that was not the idea that the Commission actually put in, so maybe it will be corrected sometime in the future. I'll come to position number 4, which is divorce is wrong, but, and perhaps you have a hunch that we are coming here a little bit more the direction that I hold. First of all, to say divorce is wrong, but suggests that, here we are, takes the biblical teaching on divorce very serious. And at times we miss that mark, I think, because we are so well trained on the exception clause. Divorce is always wrong because it is a break of a covenant. A marriage is not just a treaty that you can, or something like that, but it's a covenant. In fact, I could argue even from creation story, right from the beginning, you know, cleaving to your wife. Father, you know, in the Mark section, we had that verse from the Old Testament. Therefore, a man shall leave his wife and cleave to his mother and father, and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The word that is being used, tabak, in the Hebrew language, means actually to glue together. Now, if we have a carpenter among us, if you glue wood together, okay, if you really glue wood together, you cannot rip it apart without breaking the wood. Okay, and that's the idea. It's a covenant, that the terminology used there in the Hebrew language is covenant language, and therefore there is no justification for divorce. Okay. However, to say divorce is wrong, but at the same time takes the gospel message very seriously. There is forgiveness. That's what the Gospels are all about, what the gospel message, the eternal gospel, is all about. there's forgiveness, there are new beginnings, that is possible. And I believe applying this tension between law and gospel, sin and grace, is theologically justified. It's not only justified, it's not just an excuse, but it is really the center, it's the heart of what our Christian theology is all about. It underlines our sinfulness, it underlines our need for salvation. And in fact, I would go as far as to say we are in a fallen world and we cannot always choose between right and wrong. We cannot choose between good and bad. Sometimes, yes, we can, but oftentimes we cannot. Sometimes the choice is between bad and worse. So what we can try to do is we can try to choose the lesser evil, but it's still an evil. And it needs to be viewed as such, to be taken seriously. We can discuss that, but let's have a look at some implications of such an approach. That divorce is wrong. It may be the lesser evil, but it is wrong, nevertheless. But we sometimes do not have a choice. You know, there's this story about David when he had this, can't think of the word now, when he counted his people, whether he could go to war again. And in 2 Samuel, I think it was, it says the devil made him do it, inspired him to have his people counted. And in Kings, I think it was in Kings, it says it was God who tempted him to do that. So that in itself is a weird story. And once he did it, the prophet came to him and gave him three options to choose from. And each of the three options were terrible. The consequences, the punishment, but he had to choose. And from my perspective, he chose the wrong one. He chose the disease, the pestilence, the coronavirus of that day, and 70,000 people died. Good grief, awful. But he said it's better to fall into God's hands than into the hands of men. So he had a good reasoning for that. Anyway, there are some implications for this approach. First of all, we do not need any exception lists. See, it's tiresome to have some kind of, yeah, there is an exception. Perhaps, just perhaps you fit into that exception. You know, perhaps the violence has been hard enough, or the perversion has been significant enough, or the adultery, or whatever. No, we do not need any exception lists, and we do not need to decide on a guilty party. Who is the one to blame? We do not have to play the blaming game. And I'm coming here to you as a pastoral counselor. I don't think the blaming game helps anybody, because both, if you want to speak of guilt in a divorce, both partners are guilty, if you want to use that kind of language, and bear responsibility. But, hello, if you use that kind of language, I would suggest the church bears guilt as well. Because the church did not intervene, did not help the couple, did not support the couple. If we believe in the body of Christ and one member suffers, the whole body suffers. And we usually, now go back to the little exercise at the beginning, in many churches we just look away and say, oh, well, it's your private thing, we don't interfere. 50 years back, we did interfere, not in a healthy way. I'm not saying that was any better, but I think we have to acknowledge that the church bears responsibility as well. I'm too much of a systemic person to deny that. So we do need some grieving, and we need some confessing. And I'm talking about the church here, if you want. You see, the interesting thing is we do have rituals for burying people. Big ceremonies, funerals, we call them. Okay? We do not have any ceremony, any kind of way to bury relationships, which is about as tragic, if not more, as some people would suggest. Now, I don't think we can compare the one grief with the other grief, but it strikes me that we do not have any way of acknowledging the grief, the pain in which we should partake as a church. And as I said, I'm talking about communal confession and bearing the pain together. And I'm quoting here 1 Corinthians 12:26. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. Where's our suffering as a church? So this approach, it's wrong, and therefore we suffer. But we do have a perspective coming from the gospel. And if you hold that position, you see the need and meaning of prevention. If it's wrong anyway, well, don't get married. Okay. I knew a young man who decided he would never get married because a divorce is too expensive. And I thought, good idea that he doesn't get married if he already plans for saving money for his divorce. Need for prevention, and that is my big, where my heart is, premarital counseling, which sometimes is called primary prevention. Now, prevention is a bit of a tricky term in terms of premarital counseling, because it suggests we need premarital counseling in order to prevent divorce, which I think is a very negative. It's a European, it's a German way, you know. There always is a problem. You have to dig deep enough there must be a problem. No, marriage is something wonderful, and you want to get young couples the best start possible. So in that sense, it's more than primary prevention, but it does prevent. Good premarital counseling does prevent divorces. We need in our church marital counseling, which is sometimes called secondary prevention. So where do couples turn when they have problems in our church? Especially in the area that can be found in that bracket, you know, violence issues, issues of pornography, of perversion, sexual deviation, whatever. Okay, we need marital counseling, and in the literature we call it secondary prevention. Now, the term tertiary prevention is something that usually I find a little bit contradiction in terms, because tertiary prevention comes too late. However, especially when it comes to marriage, we know that that second marriages have a higher rate to fail and end in divorce once again than first-time marriages. In other words, we do not learn from our mistakes, we repeat them. And if we are honest, we all repeat our mistakes again and again and again. So here, tertiary prevention, post-divorce counseling, divorce groups, divorce care groups can help to reduce that kind of a risk. And in fact, the book that I mentioned twice discusses the Loma Linda approach and the Andreas University approach, because these two churches are probably one of the biggest churches in the US. They constantly have divorce groups running because there always are members in their churches who are just going through a divorce. And they have developed, both these churches have developed guidelines for divorced people to help them get back into life and to to have healthy relationships in the future and give their church members support. So there's a lot of implication for this approach, and I certainly would like to discuss this a little bit more with you. And there's so much more that I could say, and that perhaps needs to be considered. I'll just mention one issue that is not part of my topic today, but is an issue as well. How many couples go through a divorce? Any guess? Yeah, there's a guess from Art.
So yeah, Art, let me get you there. All right, you should be able to unmute.
I'm not, I think I popped my hand up just before your question.
Okay.
I had a comment and question, a couple of matters.
Can we just hold that back for a moment?
Yes.
I just want to finish off here.
Yes.
The thing is, we say every second marriage or every third marriage in Europe. It's actually, the statistics is across all European countries is about the same. Every third marriage ends in divorce, we say. Okay. I'm suggesting to you a different topic, but since it's my experience, all marriages end in divorce. Until death do us part. So either 1/3 is divorced by a judge in the courthouse. 2/3 of all marriages are ended by death. Interestingly enough, we rarely speak about widowhood, widowers and widows. And I know what I'm talking about because I am a widower, even though I'm remarried now. But that's a different topic. So let's look at divorce in the sense of marriage ending in a courthouse and a church having to deal with it. And I'll just stop the presentation here so we can look at each other and just fire away.